Esther Solomon, you are the editor-in-chief of Haaretz, and we're going to talk about Mr. Netanyahu, the protests, his pause. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you whether there is really any chance for a compromise between two sides that see a completely different future for Israel.
So, Esther Solomon, we've seen dramatic pictures over the last few days and also the last few months from Israel. People on the streets, a sense of fear from many Israelis about the state of their country, their democracy. I mean, how big a moment, firstly, is this for Israel in terms of its history and its constitutional history?
Well, I think that it's really one of those moments in history that is unprecedented. There hasn't been such a sustained series of protests, a protest movement that really has such substance as we've seen. It's already 12 and a half weeks that it's been going on. And we haven't had the trigger for that, which is, a right-wing religious government that is intent on changing the constitutional face of Israel.
So what are all these protests, which have been going on since the beginning of the year, all about? In short, it's the Netanyahu coalition's attempt to reduce the power of Israel's Supreme Court, the highest in the nation. Israel doesn't have a written constitution, and the Supreme Court plays a powerful role in keeping checks on the government and scrutinising, even throwing out new legislation. Like, say, if the laws could compromise personal freedoms or disadvantage minorities. Now, there are many aspects to the proposed reforms, such as changing how judges are selected, and even giving Parliament the ability to overturn Supreme Court decisions just with a simple majority. And some reforms have already been passed. Last week, the Knesset approved a law that limited the way a Prime Minister can be declared unfit for office. All of these proposed reforms, taken together, would constitute the most significant shake-up to Israel's judiciary since its founding in 1948. These protests have been going on for 12 weeks. My understanding is that in the early days it was a mainly sort of left-wing element from the country, but we've seen it sort of really grow. Is that right? And how momentous is that in terms of, you've seen members of the military, for example, get involved?
I'm not sure that I would entirely agree that it was only a leftist protest from the beginning. I actually went to the very first one, which was outside the Knesset, when the new government was being sworn in. And, admittedly, it was in the early days, it was a much smaller protest. But even then, you could see that the protesters were coming from many walks of life and not just from what could be considered the left, definitely centrist voters as well, and people from all different parts of society as well. Now, since then, obviously, the protest movement has mutated and grown into a completely different creature that basically now encompasses almost every part of Israel, apart from the ultra-Orthodox and many parts of the religious nationalist communities. There are doctors and nurses, there are social workers. We had for a few hours earlier this week, we had a general strike that closed down the airport. We had no diplomatic missions open abroad. It is not correct to say that now that it is in any way a leftist based protest movement. In fact, it is to do with who is for liberal democracy in Israel, and that includes parts of the religious community as well.
Do you have a sense in terms of polling, that if this is in some way a divided society with this sort of, the ultra-Orthodox, the right wing on one side and the rest of society on the other, do you have a sense of what's the numbers there, and how did it come to a position where the Israeli government is beholden to Mr. Netanyahu and a coalition of the very right wing?
Well, that goes back to the elections in November of last year. We had a roiling political crisis where we had 5 elections over the course of a few years. And then finally, Netanyahu managed to cobble together a coalition by winning the election in November. And because he is himself a subject of the judicial system right now. His trial is ongoing. A number of the parties that he might have been able to approach in the past from the center or even from the center right absolutely refused to sit with him. So the only coalition that he was capable of forming was this much more homogenous right-wing bloc, which included parties from the far right, which had never had anything like that kind of political representation or power in Israel. In fact, were considered as completely taboo. He brought them in. He was their godfather in the whole electoral cycle, brought them in, and then brought them into the cabinet as well. So the coalition that he holds right now is 64 out of the 120 members of the Knesset. So that is his, that is the basis for the government that he established. Now, since then, and this government has only been in power for 3 and a bit months, the protest movement and the degree to which the drastic changes to Israel's character and democratic identity have grown, his support, even in his own party base, is dropping quite drastically. There were polls out only a few days ago which shows the Likud, his party, dropping by 7 seats. And if the elections were done over today, that he wouldn't have sufficient numbers to build a coalition anymore. So all it has done has broken the advantage that he had number-wise. Obviously, if an election was right now and not later on, but he has managed to alienate even people who went out and voted for him not that long ago.
These protests are obviously about the judicial reforms that have been pushed by this coalition. Can you just explain to me what those reforms are and why it is, in particular, the right-wing elements of the coalition, why they want to have these reforms?
Well, there's an excellent question. Basically, first of all, there's a question of language. So the government presents this as a necessary, in fact, essential reform to the judicial system. Those who dissent from that view would call it more of a constitutional coup. Even people call it a regime change. And I think even in those terms, it's an obvious power grab for the government. But what Netanyahu's justice minister presented at the beginning of January was a plan to drastically change the balance of power between the different branches of government in Israel, most importantly, to weaken the Supreme Court and to give the governing coalition almost unlimited power. And there are various components of this judicial overhaul that the government wanted to put forward. Perhaps the 2 most important was that the government wanted to ensure that it had effectively the power to choose who would be the judges in Israel, both in the Supreme Court and in lower courts as well. At the moment, there is a different system of who chooses the judiciary, and the government does not have any kind of majority on that. In fact, it's balanced between judges, politicians, and members of the legal profession. So he wanted to overturn that kind of balance in order for the government to be choosing the judiciary. And the other significant part of this entire rewriting of Israel's judicial and constitutional system was something called the override clause, which would allow the Knesset, Israel's parliament, to overturn rulings made by the Supreme Court. So the overriding narrative is from the right to say that the Supreme Court has is overreaching its authority, and it's time to stamp them down. The elections happened. The real voice of the people is in the Knesset and in the government, and these, what it considers to be unelected elites, are having far too much power to suppress the kinds of laws that a government wants to pass.
And just quickly, Esther, is there a particular example which these right-wing elements cite from the Supreme Court of judicial overreach?
They would say that when right-wing governments have tried to do all kinds of things to push through the legislation that their own electorate has asked them for instance, in terms of taking over privately owned Palestinian lands, or for the ultra-religious parties, this could be about gender segregation in the public square, that these are the kinds of protection of minorities and basic human rights that the Supreme Court has always been associated with. I mean, it's an imperfect record entirely, and also the right wing exaggerate quite extraordinarily how often the Supreme Court actually intervenes. I mean, they characterize it as this unfettered activist court. It's only overridden 22 laws in about 30 years. So, and some of those were only clauses of laws. But the image that is proposed by the right is the kinds of overreach that the Supreme Court does, which Liberal Democrats would call the protection of minorities, actually interferes with the government actually doing what it was elected to do.
And before we move on, Esther, I mean, you know, you touched upon there about the rights of Palestinians. Do you get a sense, you know, within this sort of ongoing constitutional crisis with thousands of Israelis on the street, what on the Palestinian side, what they're thinking? You know, is there a sort of sense of, well, this is good because we definitely don't like a right-wing coalition that sort of defends Israeli settlers on the occupied territories? Or do they also sort of say, well, it's interesting that, you know, thousands of Israelis would come out in the streets for judicial reform, but perhaps they wouldn't come out in similar numbers to sort of support the Palestinian cause or Palestinian rights?
Well, for Palestinian citizens within Israel, there is a very live debate right now about whether how far to participate in these protests, exactly for the reasons that you just expressed. On the one hand, it is clear that a government with such a far-right element and a religious nationalist element that wants to use these constitutional changes and judicial changes in order to push through things like easier annexation of Palestinian lands, more inequality in policing and in budgetary allocations within Israel, that is a clear threat to Palestinians, both citizens within Israel and in the West Bank as well. On the other hand, Palestinian citizens of Israel quite rightly say, when we were suffering from discrimination and other oppressive regulations, where were the big protests then? So there is a tension between the fact that the Jewish protest leaders are saying, listen, you know, you are part of this struggle as much as anyone. You're 20% of the population. Come out with us. And it's objectively true that if this any parts of this judicial overhaul went into place, it would be Palestinians who would be the first and perhaps the most targeted out of these kinds of things, because it's exactly that protection, and they would have nowhere to go to appeal for laws that may quite explicitly discriminate against them. They would have nowhere to appeal to.
And so, you know, Esther, we've seen this pause by Mr. Netanyahu on the reforms, seeking compromise and waiting to the next session of the Knesset. We saw that sort of U-turn, or whatever you want to call it, from Mr. Netanyahu after, of course, all these protests, his defense minister speaking out, who he then fired, the president spoke out about it, even the White House quite rarely spoke out about it. What do you think ultimately pushed his hand in terms of announcing that pause?
I think that he was staring into the abyss. I think he saw that the country was on the verge of becoming ungovernable because entire sections of the economy had simply halted. The protests had become absolutely enormous. You know, the biggest spontaneous protests were triggered by his firing of the defense minister, which was a moment that I think people felt that the ground was actually moving under their feet, whereas there was fear that the government was clearly interested in enfeebling Israel's liberal democracy. Suddenly there was the feeling that perhaps they wanted to have an obedient defense minister whose only sin was to say, listen, you are pushing Israel's defense reservists and its capacity to secure the country to its absolute limits. And then that moment that he was fired, it was like a firework went off. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets, into this incredibly spontaneous expression of anger and fear that really the most basic kind of fundamentals of how the government was behaving were entirely unpredictable and potentially quite threatening. And I think that was, yes, there was noises from the international community, and the United States slowly was upping its rhetoric, but there were the beginnings of rumblings within Netanyahu's own Likud party. And he was perhaps fearful that he wouldn't even manage a majority if he slammed through the legislation in the Knesset, and that his own position might be beginning to rock. And therefore, it got to that place where he realized that some kind of noise from him had to happen. I call it noise because you could call it a time out, but he certainly is not intending any kind of committed halt to proceedings.
But on that issue, Esther, you know, Netanyahu is the longest reigning prime minister in Israeli history. He's meant to be this.
Reigning is definitely a good term. Yes,
he's meant to be a political. You know, he's meant to know the way of politics, and here he is caught in a corner. Is this because this isn't something Netanyahu himself actually wants? He's just been pushed into that corner, or does that actually ultimately not really matter? He's in this position because, well, he wants to be prime minister, and that's where he is.
Well, there is a whole science of bibliology, just like there used to be Kremlinology. I'm not sure I would go into that because I don't really care so much about what's going on inside his head. I care about what he's actually doing. He decided to choose this very ideological right-wing politician, Yariv Levin, as the justice minister, who set off this entire storm of the legislation. He has decided to allow, to give so much power to really radical elements in his coalition. He decided to make the fundamental decisions, such as firing the defense minister. He decided to threaten Israel's relationship with the United States and the Biden administration, as has happened in the last few days. And according to all the reporting that there is now, Netanyahu, even if his instinct was to try and halt things before it got to quite such a crisis, it was his son and, you know, the far-right ministers in his government who are of a like mind that they would prefer to see the country burn rather than to ever retreat. they were the ones who were pushing him not to do what was the right thing.
And so I guess, finally, Esther, Netanyahu has said he will pause these reforms and seek compromise ahead of the next session. What does compromise mean? Because it seems like we have a very polarized issue here, two entrenched sides. Is compromise at all likely? And is compromise even what Netanyahu and his coalition wants?
I don't think Netanyahu wants compromise at all. He needs to just have a pause of time to regroup and to ensure that he can keep the loyalty and discipline within his coalition, which was, as I say, wobbling for some time earlier this week. And then after that, he will either come back in full force or begin a different kind of war of attrition and present the same kinds of legislation, but in smaller chunks. Although it sounds rather dry, this is about the judiciary, this is about how judges are chosen, this is how the Knesset legislates. Really, the bigger question is about what kind of Israel people are fighting for. And what this entire political crisis has opened up is that there really are very, very, very different ideas about what kind of place people want to live in, what should be the balance between Israel being a Jewish state and a democratic state. What kind of emphasis do you put on liberal democracy? How much you put on more right-wing populism? Is the ideas that there's a deep state out there. There are right-wing politicians that have said for years that they want to destroy the Supreme Court with a bulldozer. That is a quote that is going around. So there are settlers in the government who see that they have a messianic destiny to annex the West Bank and create apartheid-like conditions for Palestinians. There are ultra-Orthodox sections of society who want basically an autonomy from many parts of the state. So there is a proximate reason for these protests, but as they've gone on, the deeper divisions within Israel are becoming wider and wider. And that is something that not just Netanyahu, but every successive Israeli leader is now going to find very hard to put back into the box.
Esther Solomon, the editor-in-chief of Haaretz, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much for having me on.